Hi, I'm Mara Schiavocampo, journalist and host of the Run Tell This podcast, and it is my pleasure to be here today as your moderator for this Harlem on My Mind one-on-one. Conversations with leaders whose work has been influenced by, but also greatly influenced our beloved Harlem. Harlem is one of the most famous communities in the world, widely known for its contributions to things like arts and culture, but often our social justice legacy has been forgotten, even though Harlem has always been fertile ground for civil rights leaders, including Hazel Dukes, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey, and so many more. And that legacy continues today. So today we're having an intergenerational conversation about social justice and activism with two amazing people who are contributing to and drawing inspiration from Harlem. We have Rashad Robinson, president of Color of Change, and the Reverend Al Sharpton, president and founder of the National Action Network. Thank you both for being here today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So this conversation is really meant to be a conversation between the two of you. So I'm going to step aside in just a moment, but I do want to start things off with one direct question to both of you. Rev, I'll have you go first on this. And that question is simply, how has Harlem influenced your work?
Well, Harlem influenced my work tremendously. I started as a boy preacher in Brooklyn. I was born and raised in Brooklyn. And for some reason, when I was around 10 or 11, my parents had broke up when I was 10. And we had lived in Queens for since I had 4 weeks. My mother had to bring my sister and I back to Brooklyn from Queens. And for some reason at age 10 or 11, I watched a lot of news because I didn't play with a lot of the other kids. It was awkward for them to be playing with a kid that their parents would go hear preach. And I became mesmerized with Adam Clayton Powell. I used to see him on the news. It was during the late 60s. They were trying to put him out of Congress. So I wanted to go to the rallies supporting Adam Clayton Powell. I think I was attracted to him because he was a minister but doing something different. And I was growing up a boy preaching. And I shaped a lot of my initial social activism, studying Adam Clayton Powell, getting to know him. And he let me, ride the car in the backseat and all. And I learned about the Harlem bus boycott. I learned about what Black nationalism was about. I learned about what Black empowerment was. Adam was one of the first exponents of Black power when Stokely Carmichael, who later became Kwame Ture, and Floyd McKissick and them had made the slogan popular. And all of the social activism I learned in Harlem. And I became youth director at 13 years old of Operation Breadbasket, was the economic arm of Martin Luther King's organization the year he was killed in 68, and became like a protege of Reverend William Jones and Jesse Jackson. And I learned the dynamics of the movement. That's why I never got rattled later in my journey, because there was always tensions between the Malcolm crowd and the Martin crowd in New York. And the Martin crowd was a minority, and it was always arguments over tactics. But Dr. King used to say, and I wasn't old enough to know him, but I was very close with his wife, his son, and Reverend Jackson, Reverend Bevel, and them, that they would say, Dr. King said, that we build movements with creative tension. It's not the thesis or the antithesis, it's the tension in the middle. And it was that tension where I was challenged. And why are you with that nonviolent stuff and all of that with those that were in Harlem? So I got to know a lot of the street corner orators, Dr. Michaud and John Hendrick Clark, who later, when I started National Action Network, would come and speak for us. Dr. Ben, who was at my Saturday rallies every Saturday that I still do. So I knew these people who became historic, legendary figures in Harlem. So I think the difference between the Southern-based King movement and what I've been able to be a part of with the movement coming north was Harlem, because the terrain in the South was much different than it was in Harlem. And I think Harlem made the movement more urban and more addressing the times of the 70s, 80s of Black consciousness all the way into Black Lives Matter. And Harlem was the capital of Black America for social justice as much as it was for culture in the Harlem Renaissance before my time, or in the Black Power movement when I was just a kid. So I was born in Brooklyn, but I was fine-tuned and trained in Harlem.
I love that. I love that. I grew up on Eastern Long Island, the last exit on the Long Island Expressway. My family got there through the Great Migration, farm fields of Virginia and North Carolina to the farm fields of Eastern Long Island. So I grew up in a town called Riverhead, which is sort of the last town with like a kind of significant, any type of significant Black population as you head out east. Although, there's folks on the North Fork and the South Fork as well. And my family been there for many generations. I went to the same high school that my grandmother went to. I grew up, though, inside the New York media market. So Harlem played such a visible role in sort of the narratives that I received very early on about Blackness, both in sort of all the sort of positive ways around the Harlem Renaissance that you learn about, the readings of Baldwin and other folks, but also the portrayals. Central Park 5, these stories that sort of shaped my upbringing and shaped sort of my understanding of Blackness. I actually remember one of the first early moments of activism that I remember was when a group of high schoolers, when I was, I guess, in middle school or younger, were taken out of school and sent down to a police lineup by the principal without their parents' knowledge. And I remember actually Reverend Sharpton showing up to Riverhead along with other activists from New York to help rally and do accountability in the school. And it was one of those moments where I was seeing sort of real visibility happen. But from my perspective of Harlem, it was a place where we would go as a family to like shop, to engage. We had a cultural experience. And when I finally moved to New York, it was where I landed. It was the community that I wanted to be part of. It for me represented such a kind of visual representation of what it meant to be connected to both community culturally and politically. And so I devoured everything I could about Harlem before I got there. And then when I moved to Harlem, I tried to be as much a part of being in a community that was unapologetically Black, where Black was a noun, not an adjective, not a descriptor, but it was the sort of centerpiece. And it was the first time I got to sort of live in a community where, I lived in a household that had that sort of where Black was the centerpiece. I got to live inside of a community was that. So Harlem has always represented for me a place that both sort of had a real cultural and political significance. And growing up where I was, very much seeing sort of the leaders. And the final thing I'll say is that as a person who got involved in politics early on, and would sometimes be the person knocking on doors for the progressive candidates out east, I remember when we had tight congressional races, Congressman Rangel would come out and go to the Black churches to rally the Black churches. And I think maybe the last race before I left Long Island and went away, I got to I wasn't driving Congressman Rangel, but I was sort of leading them, and him and Congressman Lewis were following me as I was like going from church to church and taking them, to the couple of Black churches on Eastern Long Island. And I do remember getting them lost on the way and being incredibly both embarrassed because I was so nervous about having this responsibility. And I got them lost. And I sort of always sort of remember that as I have sort of went through the streets of Harlem, of the sort of time when I got the great Congressman Rangel lost on Eastern Long Island, my one moment to sort of make an impression on Harlem, and I failed miserably.
Rashad, one of the things that I was very anxious about talking to you about is just like the older generation when I was growing up was reluctant to grow into certain more progressive politics because they were more establishment. And we fought, and they made that transition. And I guess to the generations behind us, we became the establishment. But one of the things that I've always marveled at your evolution is you helped to bring the movement into the technological age, the internet and all. When I was growing up, it was the newspapers, and it was what was on black radio, and maybe once in a while we could get a show like It Is with Gil Noble or Positively Black. Tell me how you were able to navigate and the challenges you had in navigating, bringing the movement into the internet, which had been mostly white and Eurocentric until your work. I mean, you're still very young, certainly to me, but you pioneered that to where you could do what we used to have to try to hope we would get on television, use black radio and rallies. I remember we were doing something around Trayvon Martin, and one of the ministers said to me, "Yeah, we got to get our flyers." I said, "No, they use Twitter now." I mean, a lot of people didn't make that transition, and I think a lot of that transition in social justice happened under the leadership of Rashad Robinson. Talk about that transition and the challenges you had, and how it may look seemingly now, but it was not that easy, I'm sure, in terms of you having to fight for that space and having to fight whites that dominated that space for you to do it and not lose your identity.
So I really appreciate that, especially coming from you, who really has modeled what it means to be able to get people to pay attention to things that they were not paying attention to. To force things on the table and to be unignorable in so many ways. I mean, I just think about, you mentioned Trayvon, and I just don't know if that would have ever been a moment the way it was if you had not kept that story in the spotlight. And I think a lot of that, right, from our perspective, is this theory that we have of translating presence and visibility into power, and how we really think about using the internet and social media as we think about it, not as just a tool for awareness, but a tool for action. If we can give people strategic things to do, what we can do is we can make individual people their own media channels and their own media outlets, give people the ability to sort of harness the information and use and leverage people as nodes in their own networks. The early days of Color of Change were tough. I mean, I think folks didn't believe that, Black folks use the internet the way we do. Folks didn't believe that we could actually do the things that we said we were going to do. And then over time, even as we proved the model to work, I think we still face uphill battles in trying to basically have the resources and the infrastructure necessary. Over time, we've had to build our own tools. We've had to sort of go our own way technologically in terms of how we think about data and technology, because so much of the sort of frameworks that were developed were not developed for our communities. I think about the work we did in 2016 around the election and some of the peer-to-peer text messaging work, right? The Bernie campaign and other folks were having people in their homes texting voters. And we quickly realized that this technology is good, but our folks are not gonna our folks wanna be in community. They wanna be around each other. And also we were running very intergenerational programs, and we were not gonna be able to have connections. Also, a lot of our folks were not gonna know how to use the platforms if we didn't bring them into space with each other. So we started having textathons with chicken and waffles and music and community, and we had them in cities around the country and built a whole different model. While we were doing it, though, there was a kind of a criticism that well, can't you just have volunteers working at home? It seems like you're spending a lot of money to bring people together and pay for food and have music. And I was like, well, actually, this is going to pay off later, because what we're building is connection and activism. And we were absolutely right. Not only were our numbers better than many of those other programs because we kept people engaged longer term, but people have come back multiple cycles over time and built networks with each other. And so I think what we've tried to do in the digital era is recognize that as much as we live in in geographic communities, we live in virtual communities. And as much as we want to make sure we have engagement online, people want to be connected to other people. They just don't want these things to sort of come out of nowhere. They want to know who's behind it. They want to know who the people are engaged. They want to be in conversation. So what we've had to do is really meld a program, taking in so many of the things that we've learned from pioneers like yourself and others, while combining it with some of the technology that allows us to do things differently, sometimes quicker. And I'm always reminded of this story that Julian Bond told me years ago about when SNCC installed the Watts line in their Shore University office, the precursor to the 1-800 number. Watts allowed them to bypass those Ma Bell operators that were largely controlled by the White Citizens Council in the South. So a call from, Howard University to Tuskegee might get intercepted, and that information might get shared. The thing about Watts' line, which was so important, which allowed them to move that information quickly and didn't have to go transfer to operator, was that if Watts was their theory of change, they would have never actually been successful. They had a power analysis, SNCC did. They had a theory of change. They had organizing principles. They had a power analysis that led them to make choices. And then they overlaid the technology. And then they overlaid the tool. And the tool allowed them to move quicker. But if it was just about the tool, I don't think they would be as successful. And so that's also how we think about this. How do we overlay tools and technology on top of a sound strategy? That allows us to move quicker. And I think that we've learned so much from those who've come before us.
Let me ask you this as well. I think it's important. Not only did the technology expand how we communicate, but you were part of the vanguard, and like I said, one of the pioneers in that. The social landscape changed at the same time. And tell me about how you dealt with that, because I remember when I was a teenager, when I started my own youth group, when I left Breadbasket, started National Youth Movement. And I went to a guy to get advice because he'd been a main organizer in the March on Washington all before my time. And his name was Bayard Rustin. Mm-hmm. And Bayard Rustin gave me the money to start my youth group. And a lot of the ministers was like, well, we don't deal with Bayard. And I found out later because he was gay. Mm-hmm. And my sister was gay. And she used to take me to Greenwich Village and all. I'm coming out of a Pentecostal background. I thought all that was sinful and all. And then you see the evolving of more and more acceptance of the LGBTQ community in the white community before the black community. Black community, it took longer to get there. And I remember maybe a month ago, I was in a meeting with some of the other civil rights groups, which you should have been in, but that's another conversation. And President Biden said to me, who's about half a generation or more older than me, he says, you know how things have changed? He says, you can see commercials now on TV of a interracial couple kissing and nobody says anything. Or you can see same-sex couples in commercials on mainstream TV. No one says anything. And we act like it's automatic, where it wasn't that way. And that is part of what I think Color for Change has done in our community, where we don't have as nearly the amount of homophobia and, for that matter, xenophobia as we did before. Tell us about that challenge, because that was something that was not, I know from my sister, was difficult and painful for generations of Blacks. But you guys kind of got us there.
Well, I think it's been an effort. I remember 2004, you ran on a platform where you were pro-gay marriage, right? And you ran for president. I mean, I did a lot of work before Color of Change at GLAAD and spent years. And so even taking over an organization that's a racial justice organization, but racial justice from an intersectional perspective, looking at all different communities and making sure that, we engage on issues for Black LGBT folks. We engage on Black women's issues. We engage on issues impacting Black immigrants. We engage on Blackness at the intersection of a lot of different experiences. And what I've always felt is that if we can sort of build as much power for those folks that are most disenfranchised, those most left out, we raise the floor for everyone. When oppressed people win, those victories add up for everyone. But I think it has been a huge change. I think about when I took over Color of Change a little over 10 years ago, and it was an interesting news story that I was openly gay, taking over this sort of emerging racial justice organization. And now sort of an openly gay leader in leadership in Black spaces is not a story that it once was. And that, I'm really happy about that. I'm happy that there's not the story that it used to be. And I think that there's a lot of folks who stepped out early on, and you are absolutely one of those folks who were unapologetic long before it was the commonplace. I think about your run in 2004, and then back being in 2008 at the first LGBT presidential debate. And I think people don't remember this, but in 2008, they had the first LGBT forum for presidential candidates. And the top three candidates were, Edwards, Obama, and Clinton. And they all came and they all explained why they were not for gay marriage. They all gave these religious arguments. And then, but 4 years before that, there was a reverend running who actually had an argument for LGBT, for gay marriage, for same-sex marriage. And so I think that, you have been a pioneer. So many folks in the larger Black community. I think about Julian Bond calling me when I was at GLAAD and asking me to help him with this speech that he gave, where he went through Leviticus and would talk about acceptance and talk about marriage equality and talk about sort of full inclusion. I think about sort of doing editorial board meetings with Linda Johnson Rice at Ebony and Jet and working with them on their coverage. I think about all of these leaders throughout the community that use their platforms and leverage their space to open up more terrain for all Black people. And I think that that is so much of why we're here. And so much of what we get to leverage at Color of Change is really been built on the sort of choices and decisions that people made, such as yourself.
Yeah, and talk about some of the tensions that you had to go through. Because as I said, there was always the battle when I was younger between what we would call the Martin crowd and the Malcolm crowd in Harlem. And I'm sure you went through a lot of people because your activism that has now become, very well known nationally. You had to have some backlash, I would call blacklash in Harlem, that didn't want to see that intersectionalism, that wanted to be just in our silo and just us. How did you deal with that in your generation, which was a lot more intersectional in the broad sense than my generation was, but you still had that core group that only wanted to deal with just our community? How did you navigate those tensions?
I always tried to navigate the tensions by considering Black people in everything that we did. And so when I think about our community, I just was clear that our community is diverse and it's going to include Black at the intersection of a lot of different experiences. I also think that we try to run our own race at Color of Change, a lot of it by building our own independent infrastructure, by building our own channels that we could reach people. We've sometimes not been in the room, as you said. We sometimes don't get invited to certain rooms, but I've never needed to be in rooms in order to be heard. I've always wanted to build something that if we get excommunicated from something or they uninvite us to something, that I can still reach an audience. I still own a set of channels to reach people. I think about, you constantly having that infrastructure in Harlem to be able to speak directly to people, having your sort of media vehicles. And so we've built these channels to be able to reach people. And so with a deep vision that at any given time, someone's not going to like something we do. And someone might say, we're going to cut you off, or we're not going to include you in this thing. But that has to be something we are willing to sacrifice in order for us to move things forward. If everyone likes us all the time, we're not actually doing our job. We're not actually doing the work to disrupt the systems, the practices, the policies that stand in the way of our sort of full set of opportunities for a more human and just world. And so I think about it a lot in terms of what does it mean to be able to go our own route? What does it mean to recognize that people are always going to have problems? There's always going to be some tension. But if we can be very clear about what our strategy is, who we are, and then run that race and be true to it, then at the end of the day, the worst thing people can say is that, like, they don't agree with us. They don't like what we do, that they're not going to participate with us. But they can't say that we said one thing and did another. They can't say that we weren't clear about, like, who we're supposed to be, and even, as I think about that, I have a question for you that really is, rooted in, your years of being able to keep things on the front page, to be able to put issues into the zeitgeist and that weren't there, and how much the media climate has changed and how much you have changed in different ways, from the sort of street activism and community-based activism, while still doing that, but then running for president and running for office in New York, and then now having all these media platforms and being on TV. I'm interested in thinking about how you've thought about this evolution, how you've thought about sort of your how you've yet leveraged your power and your reach to do as much as possible and to reach as many people, and how much the sort of changes in the media climate have had to change how you've moved, just because, you and I have both had to face down social media platforms. I remember we've both had to show up at Zuckerberg's and had to do these things to push back. And so much of this work has changed. And you have been a person that has taken the brunt of misinformation and disinformation long before we've talked about it the way we talked about it, and long before there was a Facebook or Twitter. But now we see it in different ways. And so I'm both interested in that, and I'm also interested in, advice you have for folks who are coming up and doing this advice in terms of what does it mean to put yourself out there and have to steel yourself to the pushback and the attacks.
Well, I think one of the things that you have to learn early, and I learned early, is that you've got to always be true to yourself. If you're organizing, you have to use the methods that are available to you. So one of the things I started was the Saturday morning rallies. Every Saturday, we have a gathering, and maybe 200, maybe 300, sometime 150 would show up, but it was broadcast live on the Black radio station, which you're talking to 40, 50,000 people every Saturday. National Action Network is 30 years old this year, started in Harlem, and every Saturday, we've never missed a Saturday, we meet. That's your core group. But you can't just play to your core group. You have to talk to an expansive audience on radio and then make them pull in, which is why we can call a march and get a lot of people, because we start with a core organized group. But to transfer those people that are there into understanding the bigger picture, and that you have to keep up with the times. People now are on social media. You have to integrate that to where your radio show is also on the internet, or your television show is also live streaming. Because if you don't, you become one that is ineffective. Is the goal to be wedded to the platform, or is the goal to use the platform to get the message of activism out? And there are going to be those that are going to contradict you, criticize you, and in some ways just outright dismiss you. And you've got to be ready for that. I remember when I was very young, like I said, when I was 13 going on 14, I became youth director of Breadbasket. And one of Dr. King's top aides said to me, I was in some battle with somebody else in the movement. And he pulled me aside later. He said, let me tell you something, kid. I said, what's that? He said, did you ever play ball? I said, no. He said, well, I played football. He said, have you ever watched a football game? I said, sure. He said, activism, leadership is like playing football. I said, in what sense? He says, half the crowd is going to cheer you, half the crowd is going to jeer you. He says, your job, if you are the one that catches the ball from the quarterback, is to get the ball across the goal line. Sometimes you're gonna have to run being heckled. Sometimes you're gonna have to run getting cheered. You gotta learn to be strong enough to ignore the jeers and the cheers. Don't get intoxicated by those cheering you, and don't get distracted by those jeering you. Keep your eye on the goal line, because none of it matters if you don't score. And you got to score. He said, now here's the self-confidence you get. I said, what's that? He said, they're going to be tackling you. There are tacklers in every football game. Some you're going to have to go across that goal line with tacklers on your back. But you know the comfort you have, Al? I said, what's that? He said, they don't try to tackle you unless you have the ball. Nobody tries to tackle anybody that doesn't have the ball. They don't tackle each other out in the field. They tackle the guy with the ball. And I've grown up learning, anytime I get severe criticism, even in the movement, that I must have the ball, because no one would be trying to tackle me if they didn't think I was getting ready to score. And my advice to a lot of people is, if you were not being effective, nobody would care, criticizing you or praise you. Keep your eye on the goal line, because if you don't score, your fans are going to be disappointed and your critics are going to be justified. But if you score, it doesn't matter what either side says. And that's what I say. So when I get involved in a case, whether it was back in the day with Howard Beach or Bensonhurst, all the way up to George Floyd now, I say to the family, I said, let me tell you something. I said, I'll go with you. I'm going to try to help organize what I can. There'll be other groups involved, and they'll do what they can. I said, and let us go out front, because no family, Rashad, volunteered to be victims. And every family, yours, mine, and anybody else, have their family differences, have their baggage, have things that are embarrassing. It's better for the media type to attack me than you, because if they're targeting me, they won't go through you shot John at a family gathering 20 years ago. Let me absorb the heat, because I've been doing that, because we'll go out front and take the hits for you. The object is to maybe get an indictment or get a police reform legislation or voter reform. The object is to get the ball across the goal line. Let the tacklers run after me, not you. And if it gets too heavy and I see you open, I'm going to throw you the ball. Just keep running. And I've always operated with that kind of MO.
I love that. I think that's so clear, and so clear about power. I mean, I also think about sort of like, the activism that you've done. A lot of it has been in Harlem, but a lot of it has just been around the country. And as you've traveled over the last, several decades, working with families, working with communities that needed to bring more attention, more power, more visibility to moments. I am really interested in sort of what has evolved as well in terms of the media conversations on race. I think the way I see it is that, we've gone from a time where people didn't want to talk about race at all to now where folks want to talk about race a lot, and they want to talk about race in ways to actually hurt us. They want to talk about critical race theory and as a means to sort of squash the progress that we've made, to make us invisible. And so I'm just interested, as someone who is a master of driving these conversations and driving them in a way that gets us to the next step. I'm interested in sort of how you've sort of seen this evolution over time.
I think that's a good question. I think that one of the slogans that I learned growing up, Rashad, was those that define you can confine you. And I think that we've allowed certain elements to define the question of race. You are absolutely right. There are more people that are talking about race, but they're talking about it with the wrong premise. And if we allow them to start with the wrong premise, they will come to the wrong conclusion. So if I say 1 + 3 is 5, but somebody else say 1 + 3 is 7, the premise is wrong. So if you add to the 7, you're going to be off, because the 1.3 wasn't 7 in the first place. They start with talking about race like the discussion of race is divisive, when in fact the non-discussion of race is divisive. And the fact that when they talk about critical race theory as if that is not American history. We're going to do American history, but keep race out of it. Race is baked in the cake in American history. So we've got to reject those that start with the wrong premise and that start with the wrong argument and that define race in the wrong way, which is why I end this by saying how important it was to me to have this conversation with you, because if it wasn't for those that brought us into this new way of communicating like you have and Color of Change have, we'd be talking on AM radio to a dwindling crowd. We can talk to the world because of people like you, that we do not lose the power of definition. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to agree with us, but it means that it's accessible, the real story. So whether we do it in the Color of Change way or National Action Network way or NAACP way, everybody understands the core of what we're trying to deal with. And that's why I think for my journey, to see us go from the street corner activists that I used to look up to standing on a ladder on 125th Street to Rashad Robinson, that I can now just hit my laptop and get the information. It's been a long journey, but the message is still there, unadulterated.
Rev, you have the last word on that. And for both of you, to that end, thank you for all the work that you're doing and making sure that the message is clear and is clearly defined and in service of the culture in our community. Thank you both for your time this afternoon. It was such a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For everyone watching, you can get more information on Color of Change at colorofchange.org. You can get more information about the National Action Network at nationalactionnetwork.net. Please check out my podcast, Run Tell This, wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search for Run Tell This. And you can get more information about the events and conversations taking place with Harlem Week at harlemweek.com. Thank you guys for joining us. I'm Mara Esquivel-Campo, journalist and very proud Harlemite. Have a great one.